Okay, this is a story about what we call, hold on, turn the volume down. This is the story of what we call
This is a monument.
golden cone of pine. And there are two cones here. One of them is the limber pine, and the other is the Coulter pine. We were driving through Oklahoma and we kept seeing signs. We kept seeing signs for the pine, or no, the tree and the rock. That was it. Yes, we kept seeing signs for the tree and the rock when we were going through Oklahoma. So the tree and the rock is a tree, as you can see, that's in a rock. And this is in the middle of a highway. And the highway had to bend, an interstate highway, and the interstate highway had to bend around it in both directions, and you pull off in the fast lane and you get on in the fast lane. But you can go and you can see this, which is a limber pine. They lived to 2,000 years. It's in a piece of granite. The granite is about 1.4 billion years old. We don't know how old the limber pine is. It might be well stunted because of the fact that it's in an area of high winds and bad weather, and so that might do it. Apparently, this particular tree in the rock, well, it's the only tree in the rock. This tree in the rock was set to be such all the way back into the mid or early 19th century. And you can see there traffic going on one side of it, and if we face the other way, you'd see traffic going on the other side of it. The tree in the rock is the tree in the rock. And we began to think about this in terms of an almost religious experience. And then what happened is that it became so. Because the first thing that occurred was we found one of the pine cones from the tree in the rock, from the limber pine. It was sitting there in an area that you can see here is fairly barren of cones or anything else, just scrub. There's a sign telling you about it. But we did find this cone. And so we called it the golden cone of pine and began to think of it in terms of religion, that this would be something to worship the same way the Druids were worshiping. There's Azure waving as I'm looking up at the tree. Okay, so that's what was happening. And we began to develop this religion in earnest, thinking of it in terms of neophytes and priestesses and priests. And then we dropped the neophytes and priestesses and priests and just decided that anyone could worship the golden cone of pine in any way that one wants to. So this was a fine thing. This was a fine how do you do. And this is what we decided we were going to do. So we brought this pine cone back with us. But the story gets more elaborate because we were traveling across country. We were going for what amounted to 7 weeks, 6,520 miles approximately. And the last day we were there, we stayed overnight again at a motel. And the motel was fine and everything was fine. The next morning we got out to leave the motel. And next to the entrance was a piece of granite, much smaller than this piece of granite that you see here that the tree is growing out of, but a piece of granite nonetheless. And on top of it was a Coulter golden pine cone. This is one of the largest pine cones in the world, and we knew that this was a sign that was made to us that we were doing the right thing in taking this with us. This is earlier, and you can see we were going through something equivalent to Noah's flood. This was the great flood and rain that was covering the way toward the Coulter pine. So the Coulter pine was kind of I don't know how to put it, it was a punctuation mark. It indicated the end of everything and the beginning of something new. It was a pine cone that was astonishing in its majesty. And you'll see at the end of this beautiful, beautiful documentary of the two pine cones and the cult of the golden pine, or the golden pine cone. You could take it either way. It could be the golden pine cone. It could also be the golden cult, or the cult of the golden, or the cult of the golden cone. So it would not necessarily have to be a pine cone, but in fact it was a pine cone. You see, I'm talking to fill up space because one of the things you do with the cult of the golden pine cone, or cone, pine, golden, is you take up space with the worship. And the worship, best way to describe it, is in terms of a conversation. So this is a conversation. In fact, it's a worshipful conversation about the golden pine cone. You can see I'm stuttering because one of the things you have to do in this worship kind of thing, is you have to make up your prayer as you go along. And you have to keep talking and talking, no matter how many mistakes, no matter how many mistakes, no matter how many stikes, no matter how many you have to keep talking no matter how many mistakes you make, because that's the form of the worship of the cult of the golden pine, or the cone of the golden pine, or the golden cone of pine. We did settle on the name golden cone of pine, but now we also have the golden cone of two pines, of course, or the golden cones of two pines, because there were two pines. There may be more pines, but there were two pines, each of which produced one of these cones. The smaller cone is the limber, the larger cone is the Coulter. Okay, that should be clear. Both of these cones are female. There are male cones that are smaller, that tend to fall from the tree. So one might ask, why did these female cones fall from the tree? Now, if this was a tree in the Garden of Evil, of good or evil, in the Garden of Eden, good or evil, or the tree with the apple, or the tree with the snake, or the tree with the god, a man god who's got a beard, a white beard, which he probably lowered at times. If it was the cult of the tree and Adam and Eve, then you would have a very different story. But in fact, this was a story based on the caressing of the pine cone, the picking up, treating it delicately, bringing it back wrapped up. And then the second one, the Coulter pine, which was much more difficult to carry with us, of course. It weighs about 3 or 4 pounds. I'm not really sure what the weight is. It's sitting right in front of me here where we are now on the east coast of the United States of America, after having gone through all of these linear, straight roads that led us to and from the golden pine, or the pine in the rock, or the tree in the rock as it's known in Wyoming. Why Wyoming called it the tree in the rock when it is a tree in the rock, I don't know. There's a similarity that we who are believers in all of this talk about a great deal, which is that the tree of the rock is called the tree of the rock. Is this similitude? Is this identity? Or is this something else? Something more suspicious? Something that involves the devil? I don't think it's something that involves the devil. I think you have to take it at face value. And one of the wonderful things about the tree and the rock is that you do take it at face value. What is it? Oh, here is what it is. It's a tree in the rock. Oh, I understand now very well. So the tree in the rock is a tree in the rock. So this says something about existence, that existence is just whatever is there, no matter what you think it is. So if I call the tree in the rock, for example, the luge, which is a kind of sled used in winter sports, the luge in the rock, I could call it the luge in the rock, but you would look at it and you would see it's a tree in the rock, and it's called the tree in the rock. So it's an identity. Is it an identity crisis? It's only an identity crisis if the language you speak is other than English, because if it's other than English, to call it anything at all, or even to understand what I'm saying here, would be completely, of course, completely senseless. Now you can see here that what looks like a rainbow is actually the edge of the windshield wipers. And what we are going through here is a violent storm that brought much travesty to Vancouver, British Columbia, and some travesty to the northwest coast, the northwest coast of the United States as well. The storm was called a something bomb, a bomb cyclone or cyclonic bomb, which had to do with pressure. So we had to go through this, and this also represents what Moses did going through the desert, because Moses went through the desert while we're going through an interstate or going on an interstate. You don't go through a desert, you go on a desert when you're crossing it. To go through it might be underground. So you go on a desert for 40 years, and we were going maybe for 4 hours. Actually, it was more like 12 or 15 hours with the several days involved, through the, not the desert, but the linear desert, the interstate highway, which represents the desert because we are going more through a prairie than a desert, either going to or from the limber pine, the pine and the rock, the golden cone of pine, the golden cone of the Coulter pine, which we brought back. So we are either approaching now the Coulter pine and the limber pine, or we're going away from the Coulter pine and the limber pine, excuse me, or we're going towards the limber pine and away from the Coulter pine, or we're going towards the Coulter pine and away from the limber pine. One of the beautiful things about this religion is it doesn't take 40 years. At most, it probably would take 40 hours. So if you put a year to an hour, you get the idea of the advantages of this religion, because you can really get in a car and cross the Holy Lands. Not land, because the lands are owned by indigenous peoples and really have nothing to do with us whatsoever, except for the fact that we are allowed to visit and worship the tree in the rock, which is called the tree in the rock, either as an identity crisis, or it could actually it could be an accident. It could be that the tree in the rock was just accidentally called the tree in the rock. It could have been called a cup of coffee, which I'm looking at now, or a Hanukkah candle. It could have called anything. So it might just be coincidence that the tree in the rock is called the tree in the rock. Now the Coulter pine is different because there was no sign where the Coulter pine was outside the motel. The Coulter pine was just sitting on a piece of granite, right? And the granite was similar in shape, believe it or not, to the granite where the tree in the rock was. So the Coulter pine cone was sitting there on the piece of granite outside the motel in something that was very much a simulacrum, as Jean Baudrillard might have said, a simulacrum of what we were looking at when we were looking at the real thing, which was the tree in the rock that was just coincidentally called the tree in the rock and was actually part of this 40-hour trek, which represented the 40 years wandering in the desert, which was not a desert, because in fact you can see right here it's a prairie, and you wouldn't wander in the desert, you would wander on the desert. So here we're wandering on an interstate road, which is actually keeping us going in one direction instead of wandering around in so many other directions that it might be inordinately confusing. We might never have found the tree in the rock going one way or another. We did see the tree in the rock in both directions, by the way. Excuse me while I drink a cup of coffee. Good. We did pass the tree of the rock in both directions, but in one direction we thought, no, we're not going to stop. Because why? Why would we stop? It's nothing but a tree in the rock. That seemed like inordinately foolish. So on the way back, we thought, the tree in the rock, we have to see if it is the tree in the rock. And then if the identity crisis is in fact a coincidence, which we truly believe it is, or whether it actually referred to it as Kripke might have it with the theory of natural kinds, it might have been called that, somehow related to the fact that there was an isness of the tree and the rock, that's the tree and the rock, and that would explain it, and so you wouldn't have to do all this coincidence stuff. But I prefer the coincidence stuff because it's completely absurd to call a tree and a rock when anybody looking at it would see it's a tree and a rock, and you don't need to do anything else, as a matter of fact, but just go with that. That's a tree and a rock because it's called the tree and a rock, and you didn't need all of this theoretical explanation with it. So Adam and Eve, in their version, they went around naming things, and of course, to name a tree and a rock isn't really naming it. It's just saying, oh, yeah, I see what that thing is. That's a tree and a rock, and you could go along. So Adam and Eve might have seen, say, like a pussy cat. You might say, oh, there's a pussy cat. Oh, yeah. Well, are we going to call it a pussy cat? Yeah, why not? It saves us having to make another name up. So back to the tree and the rock. So you can see this road seems to go on forever. And in fact, this might have been the largest section of this. And now we step into a mysterious section where you actually get to see the cone. This is the Coulter cone under natural light. And it's kind of remarkable. And here you can see the hooks on it. This is the female cone. This is where the stem area is, and there's a red blossoming around the edge. And here it is. It's about, I'm guessing it's about a foot long maybe from end to end. We did try to determine whether there are any insects or other plant life, but occurring within the interstices of the protuberances, but we didn't see anything moving whatsoever, and this is just what you have. This is all sap, and the sap, luckily, is not falling into the room because the sap is particularly sticky, and we had to wash off just a couple small pieces of it with alcohol in order to cleanse ourselves. Alcohol cleansing is one of the most important things that you do with the tree and the rock of the golden cone of pine. It's inordinately important that you use alcohol cleansing. So here are close-ups of various sections of it, and I must admit, to be quite honest, I was astonished at the beauty of what the tree and the rock could produce in terms of the tree and the rock producing the true tree and the rock in terms of the Coulter pine and not the limber pine, which was much smaller and of interest, but not quite as much of interest as this enormous cone, which is, of course, the golden cone. This now is the limber pine cone, and you can see it's considerably smaller, different shape. It doesn't have the hooks, and it has its same internal and amazing inert beauty to it. So that's the end of my story, and I hope you will join us in the worshiping of the golden cone of pine, or the golden cone of the tree on the rock, or the golden cone of the limber pine and the Coulter pine and the tree on the rock, which coincidentally is named the tree on the rock, as this is nothing more or less than a religion that's pure coincidence. So it's a religion of coincidentiality, and you can call it that. And thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me in the worship. Thanks to Azure Carter for so much of this, and thanks to the limber cone and the limber pine for everything in the world.